So, when we last left our heroes, they had just decided that they could again discuss slavery in the House of Representatives, which, of course, sounded like a reasonable idea, considering there were some pretty significant issues vis-a-vis should slavery be able to extend into the Western territories, did people have the right to ban it from the Western territories, things like that. But of course, the Northerners and the Southerners are pretty far apart on this issue, and therefore it's going to lead to a lot more conflict than it's going to actually resolve. So here we see the House of Representatives, well, this is the Senate, debating a new bill on slavery, and yeah, it's not going to go well. So the big question is, where can slavery actually expand to? And we sort of talked about this problem earlier because, of course, you've got all of this new territory that we have acquired here from the Mexican-American War. This is all the stuff that came out of the Mexican Cession. They're going to, of course, sort of reorganize it into a couple different territories. Texas is going to give up some of its northern claims. And, of course, Utah territory, you can see, is going to stretch out a little bit there. And New Mexico territory to the south. And then, of course, California, and what the heck is going to happen there. So there's a series of debates over where can slavery expand, and what do we do in areas where we haven't decided yet if slavery can expand. One potential solution was proposed by a Democrat, Lewis Cass of Michigan, and it's something that he called squatter sovereignty, but eventually became known as popular sovereignty. And it's pretty straightforward. Here's a political cartoon of Lewis Cass explaining his position. And his basic position was, why don't we just punt on this? Why don't we let the territories themselves decide whether or not they want to be free territories or slave territories? And then they can vote, and I don't have to talk about this, and I can sort of dodge the question whenever either a pro or anti-slavery person talks to me. And so this becomes one of the sort of deflection of the Democratic Party of the slavery question is say, like, well, you know, it doesn't really matter to me whether or not slavery expands, but why don't the people of the territory decide? And of course, as you know from your Kansas history, this opens up a whole new series of issues. It absolutely does not solve the problem, and it creates a lot of conflict and eventually violence. But it seems like a really good idea because you can appeal to people in both sides without actually having to ever say what you truly believe. So there's Lewis Cass. This is one position on the expansion of slavery. This leads to a whole nother faction within the Democratic Party that starts to embrace a principle called free soil, which is the idea that we should absolutely not expand slavery into these territories. All of the land that was acquired should be free and be distributed or be able to be farmed by small-scale sort of yeoman farmers, sort of out of Jefferson's vision. And we shouldn't move plantation agriculture into these new territories. Martin Van Buren becomes sort of the figurehead of this new free soil party, and he saw it as sort of a compromise position between the Democrats. You know, then you can get sort of the small-scale Jacksonian Democrats on your side, but you could also sort of appeal to the abolitionists by saying that, hey, look, you know, maybe we're not getting rid of slavery, but we're at least slowing the expansion of slavery. But the problem was, the Democratic Party wasn't, I mean, the distance between the two parties was pretty far. And as you see Van Buren trying to stretch between them, it looks like it's really not going to go well for him. But the added effect was it really destroyed the Democratic Party. Because when the Democratic Party adopted sort of this popular sovereignty platform, the Free Soilers walked out and started their own party. And of course, whenever a party splits and a faction goes off to start their own party, it's not going to go well for the party that they just left. So here they are burning down the Democratic Party. But it should be noted that the Free Soilers and the abolitionists also didn't get along that well. And the Free Soilers used really, really racist arguments about how, well, you know, free soil means that we can keep all people of color out of these territories and just keep them all white. And so the Free Soilers, a lot of them, not all, but a lot, took a very strong sort of white supremacy position. and they were 100% not for equal rights. As we see here, Martin Van Buren being very, very hesitant to embrace a racist caricature of a black lady. So, free soil and abolition, not necessarily the same thing. So this brings us to the election of 1848, where slavery and the expansion of slavery is going to be sort of front and center, but also sort of off to the side. It's an interesting election because it's a three-way race. And so you've got your Democratic nominee, you've got your Whig nominee, and then you've got your Free Soil nominee. Martin Van Buren, as the Free Soil nominee, is for some reason riding a bison there. Lewis Cass is riding some sort of weird tricycle. And then we're going to get the return of Zachary Taylor, who is going to be the Whig nominee for president. And Zachary Taylor, as we talked about a couple days ago, was the hero of the Mexican-American War. He was sort of a apolitical, popular general type figure, which for the Whigs is really par for the course. Because the Whigs tended to, because they were such like a party of different coalitions being patched together, they tended to choose these sort of apolitical figureheads, think William Henry Harrison, to sort of stand there and, look American, and then, Henry Clay or someone else would run everything from the shadows. So, in the end, it was going to be about, this election was not necessarily going to be about positions. It was more going to be about who the Free Soil Party would take more votes from. So here we see Lewis Cass and Zachary Taylor trying to pull the cow in different directions, where Martin Van Buren metaphorically siphons off votes from both of them. And, the Democrats, of course, attacked Taylor for being a butcher, which, fair. Though the Whigs don't have a particularly good track record of nominating, like, solid politicians. And I love the caption of, like, the one qualification for a Whig president. Yeah. But the end result was Van Buren, being a former Democrat, took way more votes from the Democrats than he took from the Whigs, and Taylor was a popular general, and as we know, people like to vote for popular generals, and the end result is this mess. And so Zachary Taylor, a man who was utterly apolitical, he was a Louisiana slave owner, so Southerners sort of felt like he might be on their side, but he had never voted before he ran for president. And when they gave him the letter, when they tried to send him a letter to tell him that he was the nominee, he didn't get it because he refused to pay the postage for it. So, like, he wasn't a particularly, keyed in, or he wasn't a particularly active political figure, let's say. And so Zachary Taylor is going to become president, and the Whigs are going to sort of the Whigs are going to run things from behind the scenes. Oh, and here's Martin Van Buren, of course, playing spoiler again and stealing the presidency from Lewis Cass by running as a third-party candidate. So, what we really need here, of course, is a new Missouri Compromise, because we've got all this territory that doesn't really apply to the Missouri Compromise, and so we pull out, of course, the architect of the first Missouri Compromise, Henry Clay, and he's going to be the guy to sort of push this whole thing forward. And so Henry Clay starts laying out a compromise, and then and of course, sorry, before I got ahead of myself there. And so the real issue is California needs to come into the Union. California, because of the gold rush of '49, you had a gold discovered at Sutter's Mill, and then you've got this massive influx of people. All of a sudden, the population of California booms. It's 1850, and California needs to become a state. And we've had this thing happening since the Missouri Compromise, that whenever a free state comes in, of course, what also needs to be admitted? I mean, a slave state, because you have to keep the balance of power in the Senate. And so California is coming in, and it's clear it's going to be a free state, because there are, like, very, very few slaves there. And there's no corresponding slave state. But how do you get the South to agree to that, considering this means they already don't have power in the House of Representatives, because, of course, the population of the northern states is much larger. And now they're not going to have power in the Senate either. So how do you sort of balance that out? Well, you're going to need a you're going to need a large compromise, something, you're going to need to give the South something in order to get them to agree to California's free state constitution. And Zachary Taylor, ironically, starts to come out in favor of just admitting California and not giving the South anything. Despite being a slaveholder, he starts to side with the North. And then he dies of the deadly combination of too many iced cherries, lemonade, and cold milk on a hot day, which, will kill more presidents. And so Zachary Taylor dies of cherries, lemonade, and milk. And now we get Millard Fillmore as president, who is a northerner from New York. And he's actually going to be a relatively adept sort of middle ground here, because he's somewhat sympathetic to slavery, but he's also a northerner. And so he's going to be able to keep the two sides apart. Here we see John C. Fremont of California and James Buchanan trying to kill each other. And Fillmore, of course, is going to be able to sort of navigate that middle ground. So what we end up getting out of this is something that becomes known as the Compromise of 1850. And it's brokered, of course, by our favorite compromiser, Henry Clay, for his sort of last gasp here. So, the Compromise of 1850 has a variety of different parts. First, California. California, as I said before, is going to come in as a free state. And there are not going to be any slave states coming in to sort of counterbalance it. And so this means the North is now going to have power in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And the South is going to be a minority in both. So that's kind of a big deal. The second component is Washington, D.C. Slavery is not going to be banned in D.C., but they are going to get rid of the slave trade and the slave markets in D.C. And so this is also sort of something that they're going to give to the North, because the hypocrisy of preaching about liberty and equality and all these things while slaves were being sold like down the street from the White House and the Capitol building was starting to grate on abolitionists. So this is something that they've been pushing for a long time. Popular sovereignty is going to be used as the way to determine whether or not Utah and New Mexico were going to be either slave territories or free territories. And this was sort of throwing a bone to Southerners, because then they were like, well, you could expand slavery there. But honestly, neither Utah or New Mexico territories were particularly well suited to slavery, and so they would both end up being free territories. So, this would establish the principle of popular sovereignty going forward, which is going to be a really big deal. So they're not going to go with the free soil side. The Democrat, or even the Whigs, are going to also sort of embrace popular sovereignty as a compromise, which is going to cause problems later, as hopefully you know. So the South is going to need something really big in order to balance this out. And honestly, like with any good compromise, a lot of Southerners were really unhappy about it. You read in the document, of course, John C. Calhoun's invective against the Compromise of 1850. He was actually too old at this point to effectively speak it, but he had someone else read it for him. And so he was utterly against this, and this was a betrayal of everything that America stood for and all this stuff, because, as you remember, John C. Calhoun, his basic platform is slavery is a positive good for everybody. And so he's not going to accept any sort of limitations on slavery. But for others, the fugitive slave law provided Southerners with something that they really wanted. Because although there were fugitive slave laws on the books, I mean, there's one in the Constitution, there was one in the Compromise of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, they had never been strongly enforced, and as more and more abolitionist sentiment grew in the North, they became even less well enforced. And so this fugitive slave law is going to be much stronger. It's going to allow Southerners to hire slave catchers and send them up to northern states. It's going to allow them to basically force any person of color to prove that they're not a slave. And so the burden of proof is now going to be on the accused instead of the accuser. And it's going to pay judges twice as much money to rule that someone's a slave as they get if they rule that someone is not a slave. And so that seems super corrupt, and of course it is. And Northerners just freak out about this. And, become increasingly concerned that Southerners are just going to start coming north, capturing free black people, and bringing them south to slavery, which of course does happen. And so you're going to see some significant pushback here. This is a placard or a bulletin that was put out in Boston, criticizing, of course, the Fugitive Slave Act because, yeah, oh yeah, and I should have mentioned this earlier. It also requires anyone, it deputizes anyone that you can be brought to court and legally prosecuted if you don't turn in someone that you know to be a fugitive slave. So it also, if you're harboring fugitive slaves, it significantly increases the criminality of this. And so this really sets the stage for conflict between the two sides. You, of course, read Frederick Douglass's statement on this, but it's going to lead to significantly more conflict because now Southerners have much more power to go north and attempt to recapture fugitive slaves. And for Northerners now, this is going to make slavery a much more front and center issue because for most Northerners, you know, they didn't, at least up until this point, have to think about slavery too much. I mean, yeah, you sort of knew that it was happening, but it's not like you were seeing people grabbed, put into manacles, and dragged into slavery. And now, all of a sudden, that's starting to happen. And so when the problem is like, you know, rubbed in your face every single day, you become much more aware of it. And so that's one of the effects of the Fugitive Slave Law, is it's really going to make, although it's an attempt to sort of lessen tensions, it's really going to lead to sort of a explosion of tension and an increasing polarization of both sides. And so both parties are going to really blow up over this issue. The Democratic Party is going to split further, and Democrats who didn't support the Fugitive Slave Law, didn't support slavery, became known as barn burners because the party felt like they were destroying the unity of the Democratic Party by not supporting the Fugitive Slave Law and supporting this compromise. So here's the ladder of compromise, hopefully bringing the barn burners down, but of course, you know, here's Martin Van Buren is just jumping off the side. And the Southerners, who were condemning this Northern pushback against this, were known as the Fire Eaters, who became even more radical, even more pro-slavery, and society became increasingly polarized. And so, whereas the Compromise of 1850 was supposed to lessen political tensions, exactly the opposite happened.